Hi there and welcome to the UkeStuff channel and welcome to this UkeGuide review of a vintage ukulele. This time we're looking at the Lisa ukulele. It's a plastic ukulele made of styrene, somewhere between 1950 and 1960, that time period, by a company called Finder or Finder, Fin-Der. They made a bunch of different models. The most famous one was probably the Diamond Head. Now I am not sure if the Diamond Head ukuleles today are connected to that or not. But what I do know is that they made a bunch of these, and these were actually the first plastic ukuleles of that time period to come to market. The trademark or patent for these was 3 months before that of the Macaferry. So as those companies had court battles, this company did make it out there first. A lot of differences between this and a Macaferry. So they are not comparable 100%, but they are both plastic ukuleles from the 1950s and 1960s. I managed to buy this one used, put different strings on it, clean it up a little bit as much as I could, and it's a player and it's still working anywhere between 60 and 70 years later, which is pretty amazing. So what we're going to do in this video is, first of all, we're going to look at subjective issues. Then we're going to look at the specifications. Then I'll summarize the instrument and give a UkeGuide rating. Now, before we go into that, just want to remind you, if you want to help support this channel, there are 3 things you can do. First of all, you can hit the like button. That, I believe, does help the algorithm so that this video would be viewed more and come up in more searches. Second, you can always subscribe. That's always appreciated. And third, if you ever want to actually make a donation to this work, buy me a cup of coffee, you can do that at buymeacoffee.com/ukestuff. All right, let's begin with the subjective issues. First of all, cost. Well, these are available anywhere between basically $15, and I've seen as high as $150 depending on the model. And there are a bunch of these that are very similar. So these Finder or Finder ukuleles, a couple things that will kind of stand out versus a Macaferry. First of all is that many of them will have a circle logo with the name of the brand in there. I'm trying to get so you can see the Lisa there. There you go. This one says Lisa very clearly. Made in San Diego, again in the 1950s and 1960s. Second, there will be no 0 fret here. So what is a 0 fret? A 0 fret is a additional fret underneath the nut that helps keep intonation true. That is also used, for example, on the flight travel ukuleles. They have a 0 fret. So I'll just show you. On the Macaferry here, you have the nut up here, which is again part of the plastic, but then you have the 0 fret there, which then causes the instrument to be better in tune, at least in theory. Now with the Lisa, you don't have that, but if they've got their measurements correct, it will still play in tune, and you'll still get your harmonics where they're supposed to happen. That's a little trickier than it should be for me, and I'll talk about that a little bit later when we get into the specifications of the instrument. So the cost anywhere between $15 to $150, and the cool thing about that is that it's a much easier way to get into collecting a vintage plastic ukulele than the Macaferrys. Macaferrys have been selling for more than that lately. All right, in terms of value, because again, it's a cheaper way to get into this sort of instrument, it's a really good value. Is it an extreme value? No, because the instrument isn't as good as, for example, the Macaferry. So it's not an outstanding value, but it's a good value, and again, a great way to get into collecting and playing this sort of thing. Now, in terms of build quality, you know, basically it's pretty flawless. It's a 2-piece instrument. I think I read that Macaferry is an 8. My friend Uke Brown will probably correct me on that if I'm wrong. But you have a top and a back, all which are molded, and that's it. And that's not, of course, counting the tuners. Now, in terms of the build quality, the big concern for me in 2021 when I'm playing this is the tuners. These are plastic. Now, I have seen pictures online of Lisas with metal tuning pegs as well. Same exact shape, so I know these are the originals. And they're holding and they tune. They're a little finicky to turn and so forth, but it's a very different setup than what comes on the Macaferrys with a more traditional friction peg tuner. So with that in mind, that's the one thing that's probably the biggest concern. The other interesting thing with these friction pegs is that, on many ukuleles, the friction pegs just come straight out. These come at an angle. So I'm holding this ukulele perpendicular to the ground right now, and you can see that the pegs come horizontal to be in line with the fretboard rather than just horizontal with the face of the headstock. So that's kind of an interesting design as well. It works, and I have no complaints there. But as a whole, I do get a little scared as I'm tuning these because I don't want to be under, tension and then snap as 60 or 70-year-old plastic. Now, I suppose I could 3D print replacements, maybe, but yeah, that's the one concern is the plastic tuning pegs or friction tuners. And again, there are some metal ones of these out there. I don't know if you could swap those in or not. I just don't know. But that's my only quality concern really with the instrument.
All right, let's take a look at the inside of this Lisa. It is just black plastic, so the camera has a real hard time seeing much of anything in here. All right, those holes you can see in the top, the four of them, that's the bridge that's allowing some light through in that construction. That bridge is actually molded into the top. And there you can see the seam that connects the top to the back and sides. All right, let's take a look at the upper bout now. Again, not a whole lot to see here. In a second, you'll see the seam there. There it is. And you can see an injection port on the top. Those are the big circles where they injected, molded that part together. There's the seam. And in one more second, you'll see the brace that just holds the neck. It's a simple triangular brace. And that's pretty much all you have on the inside of the Lisa by the Fender or Finder company.
Now, in terms of appearance, it's a very, very plain instrument. I mean, you do have a sound hole, like little bump there. It's different than the McAfee. McAfee has sort of that little inset plastic piece there, whereas this is just part of the mold. You have a slotted bridge right there, which is very reminiscent of the McAfee as well. And you have a plastic fretboard, 12 frets. It's pretty plain. And the real negative aspect probably of many of these Fender or Finder ukuleles is that the pattern just isn't not as nice as a McAfee. This is probably one of the lesser McAfees. There are some really pretty ones out there. One person has a blue one. My friend Ukester Brown has a whole page dedicated to McAfees, and he collects them, and he gave me this one. So again, I'm not complaining about it. I love this instrument. This is very, very special in my collection. But that finish isn't the prettiest of the McAfees, but it's still prettier than this one. Now, what you may not be able to see, though, is that in the right light, you can see some nice color difference in the right light, and there are little gold flecks in here as well that sort of stick out from time to time in the right light. And that's a nice effect, but it's lost in the overall darkness. So the appearance is really rather dark and dreary when it really, if they would have just, I don't know, lightened perhaps the main plastic a little bit from that super dark to just a little bit lighter, I think it would pop out a little more. We're not going to change that. It's 2021 and these have not been made for 60 years. So it's, nonetheless, comparatively, it's not as attractive as a McAfee. Now, in terms of availability, these do show up from time to time. So if you watch the various websites where ukuleles are sold, or you watch like Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, it's not uncommon to find some of these. Now, many of these were lost to hot cars, abuse, and other things. So there's not as many that, of course, were originally there. But wouldn't it be great to create a time machine and go back to like 1955 and buy a load of McAfees and a bunch of these sorts of instruments and bring them to 2021 and sell them as new? Even this puts a lot of the plastic ukuleles really to the test. It's far better than a Waterman, even though the Waterman has better tuners. Beyond that, the sound and the playability is so much better than a Waterman. So even these inexpensive plastic ukuleles really have some redeeming qualities that we aren't matching yet today. Now, in terms of playability, there are three things to keep in mind. First of all, it's a very narrow nut, more towards 34 millimeters, so much more narrow than you'd plan on. Second, the string spacing, though, is as wide as a standard 35 millimeter nut today. So you get less room on the sides of the neck, on the other side and the outsides of strings 1 and 4. So it can be tricky to position your finger if you're not looking at the fretboard or looking down, because you can sort of put your finger in the wrong spot if you're used to having a little more room there. And then finally, the action is very, very nice there. So it's very easy to play, nice low action. I'm running Martin fluorocarbons on it. You could run probably almost any string on it other than a metal string. You don't want a wound metal string on it, but it plays very, very nicely. Now, in terms of sound, it's a very bright sound, and that, of course, isn't hurt by the fluorocarbon strings at all. And it's a very, I think it's a pleasing sound. Yes, it is a plastic sound. You're never going to think that this is a wood ukulele. Has a little bit of that plastic snap, but it's not unpleasing in any way. However, compared to a Macaferry, I'll grab the Macaferry here. This isn't a comparison video, so to say. That would have been nice to have from 1950, wouldn't it? But the Macaferry has a more rounded sound in its construction. It's got a little bit more deepness to it. Not quite as snappy, but again, this Macaferry is running the Aquila Soprano gut strings. So that could also be impacting that as well. So in terms of opinion, it's a nice sound. It's a clear, nice plastic sound. There's nothing negative about that. It's embracing what the actual instrument is, and it does it quite well. The volume is good, middle of the road. It's got some punch and some zing to it. And again, it's a brighter tone rather than a darker tone. There's very little sustain. I mean, there's some, and you can feel it vibrating through the neck. And there's not really much happening in terms of overtones. One of the things I like to do is to let you see what I'm hearing. So I play the C chord on a GCA instrument into the app Tonal Energy Tuner, and I let you see what's happening with the Harmonic Energy series. So here we go. Now, I will just say that I'm hearing it sustain longer than it shows in Tonal Energy Tuner, and I'm holding the instrument exactly as far away as I hold all the different instruments. But yeah, the sustain doesn't hold on forever. There's very little happening with after overtones at all, but it's not an unpleasing sound. It's a plastic ukulele that was probably originally very, very inexpensive, probably less than $5, and is a great example of how good a plastic ukulele can still sound today. All right, now that we've covered the subjective issues, let's go into the specifications. It is a soprano ukulele, and the scale length is 13.75 inches. There are 12 frets, 12 to the body, like many sopranos, and there are no side position markers. Now, I did take a Sharpie and just put some dots at 5, 7, and 10, but they're already wearing off as I play. I also want to make one other note about the front position markers. If you take a look, the front position markers are at 2, 4, 6, and 8. And that is really a struggle. So for example, when I'm playing for release at the beginning of these videos, that starts on the 7th fret. And often my eye is going to the fact that there's a position marker carved into the plastic or molded into the plastic at the 8th fret. And it just messes me up. So I have to look at the side position markers that I put on there, and I'm going to have to redraw them again because they're already gone. So ultimately, that is one thing that's a little bit strange. Now, you say, what about the Macaferry? How did it do? Well, it has position markers at 3, 5, 7, 10, and even one at 12. So Macaferry got the front position markers right. This one kind of throws you off with 2, 4, 6, and 8. Okay, on to the body style. It's a traditional double-bowed ukulele. The back and sides and the entire body is made out of styron plastic. That's also true for the fretboard. That's also true for the bridge, which is a plastic slotted bridge. The saddle is non-adjustable. The fretboard is perfectly flat. And the finish is your sort of gloss plastic finish, which is kind of cool. You don't have to do much to it. It just sort of comes out that way. Now, it is 20 inches long. So it's, not a 21-inch ukulele. It's a 20-inch ukulele. And it weighs 10.7 ounces. So it's very, very, very light. Just the field test, the Finder Lisa or the Fender Lisa is lighter than the Macaferry. The tuner type are plastic friction tuners. And again, I've already talked in this video about how that sort of concerns me. Now let's talk about the action. The action is how high the strings sit above the frets, not the fretboard, but the fret. So basically, I measure from the bottom of the string to the top of the fret, and I do so at the first and at the 12th fret. At the first fret, it's less than 0.5 millimeters. At the 12th fret, it's 2.25 millimeters. So unbelievably great action to play. You don't have to press down very hard. It'd be great for a learner, but it's also great for anybody. It's just easy to play. Now, here is the big question. They have been making action right on plastic ukuleles like this and like this way back to 1950. They got it right then. Why are we still selling ukuleles today that we cannot get the action right on? Now, there are plenty of examples of ukuleles with great action today, but there are a ton that are sold with poor action. Now, some of those are very high-end ukuleles that are sold with high action because the intent is that you would buy them from an ukulele specialist who would then know how to set them up correctly to make them easy to play or to the preferences of the player. But for the other middle of the road thing where you're getting action that's really high at the first fret and action that's really high at the 12th fret for something that isn't for a professional player is a big question mark. All right, then we look at the nut width. The nut width is 34.11 millimeters, so very narrow. And the space between the strings at the first fret is 9.27 millimeters between each string, which is 29.24 GTA. That's much wider than you would expect on a 34 millimeter nut. And again, those measurements are all at the first fret for that spacing. Again, that leaves very little room on the sides of the neck for the string. That might not bother you, but sometimes I put my finger, admittedly, in the wrong spot. The final thing I check is the depth of the neck at the third fret. Now, it's a little deceiving because it's pretty deep. If you look at the third fret and measure from the top of the strings to the bottom of the neck, it's 21.17 millimeters. That seems pretty chunky, but it dips down really quick. So it's not like your typical chunky C. It's like a more narrowized C. So it's not flattened at all, but it's got a really strong curve to it to hit that 21.17 millimeters. All right, now that we've covered the subjective areas and the specifications, let's summarize this instrument. This Lisa, made by the Fender or Finder company, is a great find. That's kind of a pun there, but that wasn't intended. So if you're at a rummage sale and you see one of these, or you go to an antique store and you see one of these, and it's not too terribly expensive, it might be fun to pick up to have in your collection and to have it as a player in your collection. It's a pretty cool history piece to know that the ukulele was so popular in the 1950s and 1960s. Companies were working so hard to provide plastic ukuleles for customers. And while a lot of them were destroyed, and that goes for the Macaferry brands as well, but also for examples like the Lisa or the Diamond Head or the many other labels that the Finder or Fender company made for, there's still a lot of them out there. And there are a lot of them that are still usable. There's some that might even have, even worse cosmetic conditions than this one that still might be perfectly playable and worth owning as sort of a part of history. They're not going to be making any more of these. So at some point, they'll have even more value. Now, again, that might be something for your kids to cash in on or their kids to cash in on if you can, you know, um, leave some guidance for your kids or grandkids down the road. But it's kind of, again, a neat thing to have. And it's also kind of cool to see how companies marketed themselves. In learning more about the company, there was a brand that was written for the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. They were created for them in a plastic format. There was another that was endorsed by Cliff Edwards, Ukulele Ike, or as we know, the voice of Jiminy Cricket, who was a big ukulele player. That company had those marketers, as well as Macaferry, of course, had Arthur Godfrey selling his ukuleles on his TV show and radio show. So it's a really cool piece of history to have, and the cool part is it's living history because you can still make music with it. It's kind of fun to hold an ukulele that works and wasn't that expensive. Altogether, I think this one was $30 shipped, where I got it from. That holds something that's older than I am, and still playable and workable as an instrument. I know people that hold 100-year-old kamakas feel the same way, and I can't imagine what it's like to be a friend of Sean, an ukulele friend, and hold that original 1879 Dos Santo ukulele and play that what's known to be the first ukulele, or what's thought to be the first ukulele. Can you imagine that? And it's an instrument that still makes music today. That's mind-blowing stuff. So a really neat piece of history to have. So this company was the first plastic ukulele in the market. They beat Macaferry by 3 months. It's a much simpler construction than the Macaferry. It's a lesser instrument than the Macaferry, but it's still absolutely worth having. Plays great, sounds great, and it's a nice thing to have for your collection. The two things to really worry about, I think, in my opinion, are the tuning pegs. If you can find one with metal tuning pegs, there are some of those that are out there, or friction tuners. And then just be aware that those front fret position markers are probably going to throw you for a loop if you're used to 3, 5, 7, 10, and perhaps 12, 15, on the front of your ukulele. So, what rating would I give the instrument? Well, in terms of what we got today, mainly because of my fear of the tuning pegs. And this would have been true if we would have gone back to 1950, and I would have seen the difference between the Macaferry pegs and the Lisa pegs. That's really my number one fear. Also, again, with the front fret markers, those two things, I would rate this a 3.0, or 3 ukuleles out of 5 ukuleles. I think that's a pretty fair rating. The sound is better than that. I'm a little bit afraid and wary of and curious how many of those broke over the years, and what do you do if one breaks? Maybe you try to 3D print it, or maybe there's somebody that would custom make metal ones for you. I don't know. That's it for our look at this vintage Lisa ukulele by the Finder or Finder company from the United States, San Diego, from the 1950s or 1960s in there somewhere. You'll never know because they didn't date the instruments. So, thanks for watching the video. Thanks for joining me in this review. And I hope you're having a great day. And I'll be back soon with some more Uke stuff for you.